Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Little White Lie. The Ur-Nammu Code is a code or a group of Sumerian laws that were drafted sometime between 2100 and 2050 BC. This is so long ago, of course things were really different, but there are some laws and rules from that time that really make you go, what? One of these is the bizarre one that pertains to kidnapping. Of course, kidnapping is never good, and they knew that back then, but they were a little more liberal or forgiving when it came to certain scenarios. So basically, according to these rules, kidnapping was punishable by but only if both the kidnapper and the kidnappee were free men. If the person who was kidnapped was a slave, the sentence was just a monetary fine. Okay, that's pretty messed up, but it's not necessarily all of that bizarre to hear about the mistreatment of slaves in history. I mean, I said slaves. It was bad from the get-go, and this rule was certainly no exception. But it gets even more bizarre from here. If the person who was taken was a woman, well, I mean, a little white lie and you're good to go. By this I mean, should the kidnapper just claim that the woman had been found in the street alone without a companion, this was enough to get off scot-free because, I mean, how could he possibly know whether or not she belonged to anyone? Yeah, that really was the thought process back then. You see what I mean when I say it's just a law that makes absolutely no sense? Kidnapping is bad. It's so bad we'll put you to death, but like, it's only kinda bad when it's like this. Just kidnap the right way and we'll have no issues. In our number 9 spot today, we have royal fish. This is one law that came into existence because someone was feeling a little greedy. Since 1324, it has been decreed that all beached whales in the UK belong to the king or queen, and we can all thank Edward II for this weird one. In 1324, he passed a law defining whales, sturgeons, dolphins, and porpoises caught within 5 kilometers of the shore as, quote, royal fish. These fish collected a lot of money in medieval markets, and those who were wealthy wanted these fish for their special feasts and banquets. Of course, instead of purchasing them with your riches, what do? Well, you just make up an insane law so that you can steal them, of course. What's even crazier is that this law actually hasn't been repealed, and in 2004 there was a fisherman who caught a 10-foot sturgeon near Wales, and he actually had to ask Queen Elizabeth's permission to sell it. Apparently she told him that he could use the catch as he saw fit. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Flamen Dialis. In ancient Roman religion, the Flamen Dialis was the high priest of Jupiter. There are other forms of flamen or high priests, and many of them had bizarre rules surrounding them that they had to follow, but these are some of the strangest. Among the rules set out for the high priest of Jupiter, there were rules that forbade them to touch iron or flour. They were not allowed to ride a horse. Okay, this is weird so far, but not like too bad, right? Well, they also had this rule where if a prisoner enters their home, they must be released. Then their chains must be taken through the hole in the roof and then from the roof dropped into the street. That sounds both weird, oddly specific, and like a lot of work for no reason. The rules don't end there though. The Flamen Dialis also was not to touch or name a female goat. No flame could be carried out of their house unless it was for sacred purpose, and there must be a box of sacrificial cakes at the foot of his bed. This is actually just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the rules these people had to live by. Many of the rest really are just as curious and bizarre. I'll say this, the life of a Flamen Dialis certainly must have been anything but boring. In our number 7 spot today, we have Draco's rules. Draco of Thessaly has often been considered the author of the very first laws of Athens, which came around 621 BC, and some of the very first draconian codes were very simple. The jury is out on whether or not they were effective, but it was definitely clear. It goes basically as follows. Did you kill someone? Penalty. Did you steal someone else's goat or whatever animals they had in ancient Athens? Penalty. Did you accidentally forget to pay your taxes? Penalty. You get the idea. You commit a crime? Well, that's it. No second chances on this guy's watch. That's literally it. You're done. Sorry, you should have thought of that before you committed a crime. Also, there's some crazy things that were considered crimes back then, so I can't imagine. Anyway, thankfully his successor wasn't quite so harsh and changed basically all of that, except for the whole death penalty for killing someone thing, which like, fair. At the very least, it's quite a bit more reasonable. In our number 6 spot today, we have marital infidelity in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi was an ancient Babylonian king, and he ruled Mesopotamia from 1792 until 1750 BC, and during his reign he produced some of the earliest legal codes in history. He created what became known as the Code of Hammurabi, which consisted of 282 laws, which were listed in a sort of if-then kind of format. Each law was distinct to a social class, and the punishments were specific to the type of infraction. There were many bizarre rules here, but one of the strangest parts were the different punishments for men and women, specifically in regard to marital infidelity. So basically, men were allowed to have extramarital affairs with maids, servants, slaves, you know, of course. Women, however, what are you, crazy? Any woman found philandering and their secret lovers were punished by being bound and tossed into the Euphrates. I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Call me crazy, it's just a little bit of a double standard. I don't know, maybe I'm just too futuristic for Mesopotamia. In our number 5 spot today, we have a punishment worse than This is more so a punishment for breaking the law rather than the actual law itself, but it's something that I didn't know previously and I found exceptionally interesting. This comes from the Qin dynasty and it involves something worse than the death penalty. You might be wondering how something could be worse than the death penalty, and to that I say, great question, here's how. The penalty could be intensified based on the method that was selected for it. Like sometimes the person who had committed the crime would end up having their entire family executed. That's probably the worst thing I can imagine. Sometimes the criminal, if sentenced to death, would then have their body exposed in the marketplace or their head mounted on a pike, which was meant to disgrace their death. Not only these after humiliations, but sometimes pre-death torment also occurred. So yeah, surprisingly, the penalty can actually get worse. In our number 4 spot today, we have nope. Okay. This is a disgusting one. I'm sorry we're talking about it, but it's what the video calls for. This law comes from the ancient Anatolian people who formed an empire between 1600 and 1180 BC. This law is about what happens when a person does something to an animal. I don't want to say it, so we're probably thinking the same thing. It's messed up, you get me. So this law explains that the punishment for this crime depends on what animal it was with. A dog or a pig? No way, buddy. Not on our ancient watch. That's punishable by a horse or a mule? You're a messed up dude, and for that, you never get to appear before the king again. He can't even look at you. A cow? Well, here's the thing. The king is going to decide what happens because this one needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. See what I mean by this law that makes no sense? I'm glad that they were at least punishing people for this back then. I think we can all agree that that's the right thing to do, but it's just very strange that it differed depending on the animal. You know? In our number 3 spot today, we have who's to blame. Okay, we've been having a silly fun time for most of this list, despite the various bizarre laws that have existed, but this one is definitely a little more serious, and it's one that, especially as a woman, is definitely a touch infuriating. This law comes from Nessalem, another one of the laws by the ancient Anatolian peoples. So basically this law starts off a little better than it ends. It has to do with when someone harms a woman. Normally, under this law, this would be punishable by This is where the law goes a bit awry, however. That is the case only when the crime is committed abroad. At home, however, oh, total free-for-all. If this crime happened at home, of course, the woman was actually guilty. Not only that, but she would then be condemned to death instead of the person who did that to her. I actually couldn't believe it when I read it. Things simply were just different back then, and I truly feel grateful that this isn't a law that has stuck around. It does make me feel exceptionally bad for the women who found themselves victim to this insane rule, however. In our number 2 spot today, we have the roast battle. This is perhaps one of my favorite laws, and it's one I think we should bring back. This is officially my petition. This law is hilarious with just a little less harsh of a sentence. You'll see what I mean. This law comes from ancient Rome and the law of the 12 tables, and basically it condemned anyone who sang a joking or mocking song about someone else to but the sentence only came if what the person sang was untrue. If you just roasted the hell out of someone and everyone turned around and said, well, where's the lie? Then there's no problem. Carry on, you little musical genius, you. I mean, at least they were taking a stand against bullying all the way back then. I just think it's insane that the law is so extreme. Like a little silly ditty that's just part of a rumor mill is an absolute no-go. Don't tell the ancient Romans about magazines and tabloids or diss tracks. They'll be so mad. In our number 1 spot today, we have the innocence test. Another one of the rules that comes from the Code of Hammurabi is one that forces accusers to prove their accusations indisputably. Okay, they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. We still go by that, so that's not really that weird. What is weird, however, or maybe dramatic is a better way to put it, is that if they failed to do this, they would then be condemned to biggest Uno reverse card in history. Like, even knowingly false accusations probably shouldn't be punished with the sentence, but imagine just not having enough evidence to convince everyone and then you have to die because of it? Like, it's not like DNA testing or photos or videos existed, so how do you prove these things in a way everyone will believe you? It seems way too risky to even try. Also, one of the methods used to try and test someone's innocence is to throw the accused into the river. If they drowned, it was because the gods knew that they were guilty, but if they managed to get out alive, they were considered innocent, and then their accuser was executed for falsehood. Like, I'm not taking the chance on whether or not this guy can tread water. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have a suit of armor. Okay, so imagine this. You're on your trip to London. You're ready to visit Parliament. It's the moment you've waited for your whole life, and of course you brought your very best suit of armor. You're dressed to the nines. You're fully protected. You're ready. Well, have I got bad news for you? No armor allowed. Yeah, this is a law that made a lot more sense at the time it was created, and the weird part is that it still exists and has never been repealed. By 1313, Edward II had upset so many nobles that he became worried about the prospect of an armed rebellion and wasn't feeling safe enough in Parliament. This led to a statute that claimed that every man shall come to Parliament without all force and armor, and those who didn't abide by this rule would be punished. Since then, no one has thought to change it, and I guess while no weapons still makes a lot of sense, the whole armor thing is simply just because it isn't as popular now as it was then. Who would have thought? In our number 9 spot today, we have magic crops. Many ancient laws are extremely specific, and so much so that they come with a specific punishment to fit the crime. I mean, we have some guidelines around sentencing and stuff, so it's not that weird, right? Well, I mean, it really comes down to what the law is asking, you know? Like, for example, this ancient law comes from the Law of 12 Tables, and it has to do with crops. Basically, the law states that the crime of using magic on crops was punishable by death, this time in the form of crucifixion. Like, please, no one tell the ancient Romans about Monsanto. They'll be so angry. I so badly wish I could know what, at the time, was looked on as magic on crops. Some guy with a green thumb is getting accused of witchcraft. Also, how serious of a punishment? Imagine just making more corn for everyone and suddenly you have to be put to death in one of the worst ways? I don't know. This one seems a little extreme, but almost everything was in ancient times, I'm beginning to think. In our number 8 spot today, we have butt naked. This is a law that was first enacted in 1463 and was repealed in 1604, and it has to do with some middle-aged fashion. Basically, from 1337 onwards, laws began to be passed that were meant to preserve decency, as well as sort of govern people from dressing above their rank. I mean, God forbid someone wear one too many frills. At this time, however, men's fashion was getting a little out of hand and people were worried about the immoral way it was going. In 1463, a statute was passed that claimed that, quote, no person under the rank of lord was to wear any gown, jacket, or coat which does not cover the genitals and buttocks. Listen, this is a law that absolutely makes sense. It's just absolutely hilarious. I mean, the part that doesn't make sense is that lords or anyone above were just free to roam around with all of their bits and pieces hanging out no problem. It's truly so funny. I wish I could pay money to sit in on the announcement of this law though. Just some sad guy walking home to go put pants on. It's like, but my little butt. In our number 7 spot today, we have the right to citizenship. This is a law that was seen in a lot of different societies throughout the ages in some ways or others, and in fact was even seen in our own modern society until about a century ago. Basically, this began in ancient Greece and it has to do with women not being allowed to be citizens. Athenian democracy was only available to adult males and women were left out of it all. Women were referred to as an aste, which meant a woman belonging to the city. In fact, there was a time where, since there was no registration of women, that witnesses would have to testify in court cases to prove that women were the wives of Athenian men. Women had to work at home and were considered second-rate humans, subservient to her male guardian, whether that be her father or husband. This was all justified by the men at the time because it was actually believed that women weren't as intellectually capable as men, and because it was believed that women had a higher sex drive, and consequently, if given free range to engage in society, would be more promiscuous. Basically, they were just insecure and felt that if women had free range, then they would go out and cheat on them, so instead they just really didn't let them participate in society. Of course, it wasn't just a century ago when women got the right to be citizens, but it was just over a century ago that in our modern society, we got the right to vote. It's crazy to see how much things have changed and how some other things took quite some time. In our number 6 spot today, we have dinner time. This is a law that was first enacted in 1336. It's definitely not the oldest law on this list, but it is one that really shows what things were like at the time. So many of us have heard and learned about the over-the-top extravagance and indulgence that happened at medieval feasts, and this led to, in 1309, a proclamation by Edward II where he began criticizing the outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and other dishes that the nobles were eating. Later, in 1336, there was a statute by Edward III where he too described his unhappiness with the quote, many mischiefs caused by the quote, many sorts of costly meats which people of this realm have used. This statute, however, set out to do something about this overindulgence, and they tackled that by ruling that no man, of whatever rank he be, shall be served a meal with more than 2 courses, except for at certain festivals, such as Christmas, on which 3 courses were allowed. So basically they made a law that banned having more than 2 courses for dinner unless it was a special occasion. I can't imagine the government policing my food consumption. What makes it even funnier is that while these laws are believed to have perhaps influenced behavior, there is no evidence of it actually ever being enforced. So they made the rule to make them feel better basically, and it lasted for quite a while until 1865 when it was repealed. In our number 5 spot today, we have family crimes. This is a law that is truthfully kind of similar to one that we talked about in part 1, but this one comes from ancient Egyptian law. It seems as though much of Egyptian law was based on a common sense of right and wrong, following the codes based on the concept of Ma'at. Ma'at represented justice, truth, order, and balance, and basically this concept meant that everyone, with the exception of slaves, should be treated as equals under law, regardless of wealth or social position. If we removed slaves from the equation, this is of course not too far off from our current ideals and the current concept we strive to have within our legal system. The huge difference, however, is that when time for punishment came, it wasn't done to just the person who committed the crime. The consequences were for them and their entire family. If a person was exiled, their entire family would be along with them. If a relative faulted on some kind of labor demand or other service, the entire family might be imprisoned. I'm just saying, Uncle Gary and Aunt Lisa really could have messed things up for you big time. Like, I would not trust my extended family with my legal fate. Not a chance. In our number 4 spot today, we have fancy footwear. This is another one of those middle-aged laws that has to do with men's fashion, and this time, everyone's butts are away. This one has to do with men's footwear. Shoes with long, pointy ends called krakows or pikes were all the rage back then in the 15th century. Like, I'm talking so much so that the points were getting so long and so out of hand that they were having to be tied around the wearer's ankles or the backs of their knees. It was truly and utterly ridiculous. That same 1463 statute that dealt with everyone's butts, yeah, it also had a part to deal with the shoes, because if everyone is tying up their long shoes behind their knees, how are we supposed to know who the fancy ones are? This law stated that, quote, no knight under the rank of a lord, esquire, or gentleman, nor any other person shall wear any shoes or boots having spikes or points which exceed the length of 2 inches. Punishments for not following this one was a fine of 3 shillings and 4 pence, which is just over £100 by today's standards. I think this law makes no sense because no one should be allowed to have shoes that long, lord or not. In our number 3 spot today, we have revenge. The times of Vikings was certainly an interesting and exciting one, and while many see movies that portray the time and think that Vikings lived in a lawless, almost cavemen-like society, that actually couldn't be further from the truth. While we may not want to take up some of the laws that they lived by, they did have their own codes and laws, and we'll talk about a couple of the weirder ones today. Like this one. Vikings were expected to take revenge as described by the Glotting Code. This was written in the 1000s and is actually the oldest known body of laws in the Nordic countries. So basically, if someone did you some sort of injustice, whether it was violence or insults, you could request financial compensation. I would have been bleeding my childhood bullies dry. However, if you didn't defend yourself, there was a limit to what you could request. You were fully expected to take matters into your own hands if someone wronged you, and if you didn't, this meant that you might be giving up your right to financial compensation. In our number 2 spot today, we have the barber. Okay, so this is a law that has to do with slaves. It's an unfortunate part of history, and it's also important to remember that it still does exist in some places. This law, in terms of a society that has slaves, I suppose makes sense. It is just bizarre, however, because the punishment for this is unbelievably extreme. This law is one that comes from the Code of Hammurabi, and during this time, many of the slaves were actually former prisoners of war and their families who were then forcefully inducted into this new Babylonian society. This law basically states that if a barber, without the knowledge of his master, cut the sign of a slave on a slave not to be sold, the hands of the barber will be cut off. How extreme is that? The punishment is so severe, it makes you think that they almost cared about the slaves, but sadly, of course, that wasn't true at all. It was more so looked at as a very serious and important business venture. So serious that they would chop your hands off. In our number 1 spot today, we have facing the truth. This is a Viking law that has to do with taking someone else's life, so it's a serious one. Well, I mean, it was kind of serious back then. Basically, you could get away with killing someone, but only if you were honest about it. Like today we have different charges for different circumstances. More serious and less serious charges, there's like a ranking, but Vikings of course didn't have these exact same distinctions, and instead it was a matter of honesty and being straightforward. For example, something like arson or taking someone's life at night was actually looked down upon because you surprised them. No one else was around, and you didn't give them a chance to defend themselves. I'm like, okay, I see the point they're making, carry on. This is where things go a little awry by today's standards though. You could kill someone in public without serious consequences because you were doing it publicly, and both the person as well as those around them had a chance to react to it. The only other stipulation is that you took responsibility for it and that you didn't flee. Even if a fight broke out and someone ended up passing away but it was unintentional, as long as you were open and honest, it wasn't considered a serious offense. I guess they were just very forgiving in Viking times. Perhaps in the wrong ways, but who am I to say? Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have royal fish. This is one law that came into existence because someone was feeling a little greedy. Since 1327, it has been decreed that all beached whales in the UK belong to the king or queen, and we can all thank Edward II for this one. In 1324, he passed a law defining whales, sturgeons, dolphins, and porpoises caught within 5 kilometers of the shore as royal fish. These fish collected a lot of money in medieval markets, and those who were wealthy wanted these fish for their special feasts and banquets. Of course, instead of purchasing them with your riches, what do? Well, you just make up an insane law so that you can steal them, of course. What's even crazier is that this law actually hasn't been repealed, and in 2004 there was a fisherman who caught a 10-foot sturgeon near Wales, and he actually had to ask Queen Elizabeth's permission to sell it. Apparently she told him that he could use the catch, quote, as he saw fit. In our number 9 spot today, we have strange cows. This law is one that was repealed in 1974 because at one point, I'm sure this made a lot of sense, but surely by 1974 and especially by now, it is simply just hilarious. This law is from Texas, and it stated that whoever, without the consent of the owner, shall take up, use, or milk any cow not his own, faced a $10 fine. How weirdly specific. There was a law and a specific amount of a fine set up just for milking a stranger's cow. I mean, I feel like I understand why this one is illegal, because how strange is it to just milk someone else's cow? A little intrusive if you ask me, to be honest. Of course, the only reason you'd be milking someone else's cow would be to steal the milk, and that is still rude to do now, but back in the day that could have had much heavier implications. Although that specific law was repealed, there is still a law in Texas that is in regards to the same sort of thing. It is still illegal to milk someone else's cow without permission, but now you'll be charged with theft and trespassing instead of a flat $10 rate. Also, who wants to be the weirdo stealing milk straight from a cow? In our number 8 spot today we have cold feet. Okay, apparently since 19th century France it's been legal to marry a dead person. Yeah, had to cut right to the chase with this one because beating around the bush simply just didn't seem right. Also known as necromancy, this law dates back to times when being born out of wedlock was a big no-no. So, say if your husband was to be out at war while you were pregnant and he ended up passing away in the war, this law would help to ensure that your child was born from within a marriage. The consent of the person who passed away could either be given by their family or if there was an existing engagement before they passed. This law still does actually exist in a way, with the most current form coming in 1959 after a terrible incident where a dam burst and 423 people lost their lives. One of the most recent examples of this was in 2017 when someone's partner was killed in a terror attack and he was still able to marry his partner posthumously. While this law sounded a little weird in the beginning, I am glad to know that it had some practical and important uses. In our number 7 spot today we have no fun. Since 1966 in Victoria, Australia, it has been illegal to fly a kite in a public space if it bothers someone else. You actually can't even play a game in a public space if it's gonna annoy someone else. I really hope you don't have a Karen in the neighborhood, I guess, or no jump rope for you. This was listed as a part of the Summary Offences Act, but it's crazy that this is something that came into effect as recently as 1966 and not hundreds of years ago. It just seems like such a random rule to instate. And it was way more popular to see these kinds of no fun laws in legislation from centuries ago. Or footloose, I guess. Anyways, all of this aside, I don't think that there are many Aussies who will be upset if you choose to fly a kite on a nice breezy day. In our number 6 spot today we have no UFO parking. After a man in this French winemaking town reported seeing aliens leave in a cigar-shaped UFO, the town of Châteauneuf-du-Pape made this law as follows. Article 1. The overflight, the landing, and the takeoff of aircraft known as flying saucers or flying cigars, whatever their nationality is, are prohibited on the territory of the community. Article 2. Any aircraft known as flying saucer or flying cigar which should land on the territory of the community will be immediately held in custody. Article 3. The forest officer and the city policeman are in charge, each one in what relates to him, of the execution of this decree. Not only is this law hilarious, but it's also super effective because they haven't seen any aliens or UFOs since it was passed in 1954. I really do respect them for doing what they can to protect their vineyards, however, but maybe the aliens just want a little wine too. In our number 5 spot today we have no gum. You know when some people choose to do something wrong and then it ruins things for everyone who wasn't doing the wrong thing? Yeah, that's what happened in Singapore and now no one can chew gum. There were some people who decided to try and mess with the mass rapid transit system and they used chewing gum to do it. These people ended up costing the Housing and Development Board $150,000 a year just to clean up this gum, so in 1992 they banned it. They banned all gum substances, and so anyone importing, selling, or making gum can potentially face fines or even jail time. In 2004, however, there was an exception made for those who needed gum for therapeutic, dental, or nicotine chewing gum reasons, and those can be bought from a doctor or pharmacist. I wonder if there's an underground gum ring in Singapore now. In our number 4 spot today we have no high heels. This law is a strange one, but it will be no problem for the overpacker in your life. If you're taking a trip to Greece anytime soon, make sure you don't pack only high heels, because if you do, then you won't be able to visit the Acropolis. That's right, in 2009 the country banned wearing high heels there. I really don't know why anyone would want to walk around there in high heels. I mean, ruins and dirt don't exactly make me scream stilettos, but clearly it was happening enough that a rule needed to be made. This rule, although seemingly random, is actually important. As it turns out, people's sharp shoes may have been damaging the site, and truly that's just not worth it. The ruins are 2,500 years old, so at this point I feel like we can throw on a pair of Vans and call it a day. No one needs to wear black tie attire when visiting a historical site. Like, sorry I forgot my ball gown, can I still visit Gobekli Tepe? That was a dumb joke. In our number 3 spot today we have Jellicle cats. In 1939, in what was called, quote, a war measure to alleviate mental strain upon the populace, the town of French Lick Springs, Indiana passed a law that required all black cats to wear bells on Friday the 13th. This would make sure that anyone who heard a cat's bell was able to avoid crossing their path and having bad luck. I honestly feel like I should be making this up, but it's true. I guess I can really appreciate them doing what they can to alleviate the stressors in the lives of those who are having to live through a world war, but it just seems like there's so many other way more stressful parts of a war than black cats on one specific day. Like, imagine if we were entering World War III and we were like, nuclear bunkers? And the government was like, no, but you don't have to worry about black cats anymore. In our number 2 spot today we have Winnie the Pooh. Winnie the Pooh Bear is a well-known and loved animated figure, but he doesn't wear pants, and apparently a pantsless bear is upsetting to some people. Because of this weird issue, there's apparently a law in Poland that has banned Winnie the Pooh from playgrounds and schools. I mean, wait till they hear about all the pantsless and shirtless bears that are just walking around outside. I'm not sure how they'll be able to keep it together. I'm not exactly sure how far this one can be taken. I mean, if your kid has a Winnie the Pooh sticker, are they going to be sent to jail? Probably not. I mean, even a fine seems a little ridiculous though, right? I don't know. I guess there's a reason I don't make laws. Winnie the Pooh is just a little too risque these days, I guess. In our number 1 spot today we have Footloose. Since we mentioned it all the way back at number 7, let's talk about a very real sort of Footloose situation. This law was instituted in Japan and was enacted in 1948 while US soldiers were occupying. Basically, the idea behind it was to stop Americans from corrupting the citizens of Japan, and basically, dancing in a club after midnight was banned. It is said that dance halls often used to be fronts for other businesses during this time when the nation was poverty-stricken. The activity was considered just too sinful, but now, since Japan is one of the largest economies in the world with a high standard of living and a vibrant nightlife, the ban was finally lifted in 2015. There is still a rule around post-midnight dancing though, it's just slightly more relaxed. You can dance, but once the clock strikes midnight, you need to be doing it in a well-lit room. I'm not sure what that changes, but what I do know is that when the lights come on after last call, it's time to go.